I like baking and I like eating the things I bake. I like knitting and I like wearing the things that I knit. I think that is very okay too. For the last decade, I turned my passion into a career. And I think it was great for me at the time. But sometimes you can leave your passions to just be your passions.
You're listening to Easy Cook Bear, a food and culture show about how we cook, connect, and create. My name is Lee-Sean. Together with my guests, we'll be sharing stories, swapping recipes, and exploring the creative processes of people who make art, culture, food, music, and more. Easy Cook Bear. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Easy Cook Bear. I'm Lee-Sean. Our guest today is a UX designer based in Boston. He has 10 years of history in the fashion industry, entrepreneurship, education, and research, and he weaves that all together. He's also a baker, so we'll talk about a lot of these things. He bakes, he knits, cooks, travels with friends when he can. Dylan Uscher, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much. This is so fun.
Dylan, how would you describe your own culinary heritage in terms of your family background and how you learned to cook, what you were eating growing up?
It's funny when I first sort of was thinking about this, I was like, oh, I kind of came from like a boring food background. Like, I grew up white, northern New Jersey, American. My dad's side of the family is Jewish, and so we did eat a lot of Jewish food. But we were the kind of Jewish where we only celebrated the holidays where there were food.
Mm-hmm.
They were like we didn't do any of the fasting holidays. We just had the feasting holidays. And so I do kind of approach food that way. It reminds me a lot of joy and reminds me a lot of kind of togetherness and all of that. So even now when I live by myself, with a roommate, so I do tons of baking and cooking, but I always like to give it away. I always like to kind of help people or feed people or, even just like put a smile on friends' faces that way. But yeah, in terms of the food that I actually do make, I do try and do a lot of Jewish baking. So I have gotten very, very good at making New York style bagels, if I do say so myself. My bagels are up on my Instagram all over the place because I make them quite a lot. That was kind of one of the first things that I really wanted to learn how to do. The other thing that's kind of interesting is my parents, when I was very, very young, we lived in Japan for a few different periods. So before I was born, my parents lived in Japan for quite a long time. They were there for, I think, about like 11 or 12 years on and off. And my older brother was actually born in Tokyo. I was born in New Jersey. And then, we were there, I think, for like the first year and a half, basically, of my life. So personally, I don't remember being there, but there was a lot of Japanese food and kind of Japanese culture that was a huge part of my childhood. And so growing up in the early 90s, sushi became like a hot thing in like the early mid 90s. But I was the kid who was at my pretty much all white high school being like, yeah, I eat raw fish all the time, what of it, and that kind of thing. So I have always enjoyed Japanese food. And I think having that exposure to different kinds of food early on has helped kind of make me a little bit more adventurous and really willing to try a lot of different kinds of food. The other thing that it kind of has influenced is that I really care a lot about the authenticity of food. I think there's a place for fusion and experimentation and that kind of thing. But with my baking and with my cooking and all of that, I am much more interested in figuring out how to do a traditional thing really, really well, or to learn how this became a traditional food. I think that's super important to me.
So how far do you go with some of this authenticity stuff? Because I've known there's certain places outside of New York that do New York bagels or New York pizza where they like ship in the water or they like source the same flour. Like, how far do you go with some of this like research and sourcing?
That's the line between like authenticity and folklore, basically. Like what I have done is with bagels, especially, is I tried a lot of different kinds of recipes and techniques and found one that worked like 90% of the way a couple years ago, and then have just been making that over and over and over again and tweaking things and that kind of thing. So, but what I'm doing is trying to make like my favorite everything bagel. I don't go for like the rainbow bagels or like that kind of stuff. Someone on my Facebook sent me a video of this bagel shop that made like Thanksgiving colored bagels. I'm like, that is horrible. That's disgusting. Get out of here.
So you
Like,
don't need the
even
pumpkin
bother.
spice bagel or anything like
No,
that.
no, no. And that's the thing is like, if it's flavored a certain way, fine. Like that's an experiment. I can like vouch for that. But if it's just like we take strands of brown and orange and white bagel dough and ring them together, who cares? Like, shut up. You know. But I think with my cooking too, I recently got pretty much in the pandemic, I got into Korean food. I've been following Maangchi on YouTube and have watched
Yeah, she's amazing.
probably every single one of her videos at least once. She has been my teacher for making Korean food. And the thing that I love about her videos is she does do traditional family style Korean cooking. It's not fusiony. It's not how do you cheat to get a Korean flavor or something like that. No, it really is kind of her version of authenticity. And so I've been making a lot of her recipes and they've been great. They've been so good.
Yeah, I think what's amazing about Maangchi too is that she kind of meets people where they are, but also goes deep at the same time. So she'll say like, oh, you can just buy this thing. And then she'll do another episode where she's like fermenting her own doenjang or like making her own kimchi, like in a clay pot in her living room in Manhattan. She has that depth and can go there, but she also says like, you can just buy this.
Yeah, exactly. But she's not going to tell you to replace it with some American ingredient that doesn't make any sense, but is like halfway there to the taste. She'll never let you do that. So yeah, for example, I've made my own kimchi from her recipes and it's been amazing. I've not made my own doenjang, but I've purchased it from the Korean grocery store on her recommendation, basically. So like, you know, I know my limitations as well.
Right.
I also don't think my roommate would love having me fermenting soybean blocks in our window for 6 months. So, you know, you gotta play with what you got. So.
Right. Do you remember the last thing that you made? Whether it was like a Korean thing or something from Maangchi?
The last food that I made was yesterday. I baked a loaf of bread for my mom. I was visiting my mom this weekend. The last thing I made from Maangchi, I think it was doenjang stew. I think I made that last week sometime. But yeah, I love her recipes. She's great.
Easy Cook Bear. So you've come to UX after 10 years doing other things in fashion. You self-identify as a former fashion designer.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about your professional journey in design and how you've made that pivot?
Yeah, sure. So I became a fashion designer without any training whatsoever. I actually have a background in linguistics. I have a bachelor's and master's degree, and I decided to start my own business because I realized that linguistics was not kind of the way I wanted to go. Academia was not the way I wanted to go. And so knitting had become kind of this really big passion of mine. And I thought, okay, well, the main goal was how do I be creative for my job? That's what I want to do in my life. And that's pretty much what I have done in my whole life in various capacities and careers. So the working in knitting and fashion was kind of the first step for that. I had an experience where I promptly got fired from a job like 3 days after I started it. And I said, well, instead of applying for more jobs, I'm just going to start my own business. And then I had my business for about 8 years. I did tons of different kinds of work. I had my own collections that I sold to stores. I did a lot of private label design work for other fashion companies. I did a lot of editorial pieces, museum pieces, installations, private collections, that kind of thing. And then in addition to all of that, I did a ton of teaching too. So I've always been kind of like working with people, writing curriculum, teaching people different things. And what was really cool is that I was able to teach everything from kind of what I call moms in the yarn shop, like, you know, one-on-one classes, very beginner things, all the way through to college level technique courses. So I taught some courses at RISD, the Rhode Island School of Design, in their textiles department, and all kinds of like speaking engagements and camps, like knitting camps and all kinds of stuff. So it was really great. And I loved doing the creative work, but after about 7, 8 years, I was definitely getting burnout. Like I said, I came to design, I came to fashion without any training in fashion. I also was running a business without any training in running a business. And so you make all of the mistakes. And by the time like year 8 rolled around, I was just getting kind of tired of it. And so I took a couple of years to kind of figure out what I wanted to do. And I had somewhat of a like stopgap job where I was managing a co-working space here in Boston. And through a project I was working on there, I had ended up having to do a lot of research into tech boot camps, coding boot camps, that kind of thing for something related to a project I was working on there. And then, of course, that meant that all of my Facebook ads and everything turned into become a coder, become a data scientist, become a UX designer, become a, all these things. And I was, susceptible enough that
That's how they get you. That's how they
that
get you.
is how they get you. I took a couple like intro courses in a bunch of different areas, and UX just really spoke to me, I think, because so much of it, well, first of all, I was already doing so much of the work before I even realized, like before I could had the vocabulary to call it that. A lot of the empathy that's required and the working with people and understanding where they're coming from and designing for their needs and working closely with them. I'd done all of that. I mean, teaching and UX kind of go hand in hand so much because you really have to get on people's level. And especially with teaching something like knitting, there's a lot of emotion that's wrapped up in that as well. A lot of the students that I taught knitting to, some of them were just doing it for fun because they enjoyed it. But there was a lot of people who said, oh, my grandmother used to knit, but she died before she could teach me. And I have all of these, materials and needles and stuff from her. So, I want to be able to like learn how to do this so I can carry on her legacy. I mean, that's something that is so important to people, right? And being able to teach the skills, but also kind of within the context of that person's story, I think is so important. And I think really led to a pretty smooth transition into doing UX design and research.
And so you did the boot camp, and then
I did.
From there, was there anything you've already talked about this a little bit, but how you were integrating what you did previously into the UX part? I've noticed myself, for example, that beyond some of the technical aspects of like learning new software, learning things like that, you've already said that you have to figure out what people's needs are or understand people at this emotional level. So could you give us some examples of how you do that now in your UX practice?
Sure. I mean, I think for me, one of my favorite parts of UX is usability and testing. And I think one of the reasons that I kind of am drawn to it so much is not only is it important to make things functional and accessible, but it takes a level of empathy. It takes a level of really understanding. I feel like I'm saying the same thing again, but really understanding where people are coming from. There are projects that I work on that I guess I feel like I'm sort of a naturally empathetic person. And so I work on these projects and I'm like, oh, well, what if I don't want to say anything too specific so that my clients are like, don't talk about us. But it's like, it's so clear to me in some of the early design or early work that I've seen where there hasn't really been a designer on board that they don't think about the person who's actually using it. And it blows my mind, but it happens all the time. So yeah, I wish I could be a little bit more specific than that.
No, that's totally understandable. Just to pivot a little bit or to back up a little bit, UX has been around for a while now. I worked as a UX designer in the past as well, but it's interesting how it's both better known and valued over the years, but also a lot of folks still don't quite understand what it means. I've definitely been in meetings of like, oh, like you are the wireframe maker, and it's a very reductive kind of thing. Is that something that still happens in the UX industry?
Oh my gosh. I almost flipped out on one of my clients. I was working on an app for their company, and there were some really huge usability issues. Literally, I tapped on the thing that was a button and it didn't do anything. We need to
Yeah.
figure out where that's supposed to go. And he literally said to me, don't worry about it. Just make us pretty screens. And I I'm so glad I wasn't in the same physical space as him, because I almost like threw my computer off the desk. I was like, whoa, what are you talking about? Like, yes, I can do that, but that's not why I'm here. I'm here because you can have a beautiful button that still doesn't go anywhere. Like,
Right.
and it blows my mind that that's not the first thing that some people think of. I don't know. It's just maybe because you're in it like so much, and it just is crazy to me.
For sure, that it's not the colors or the fonts or those things by themselves. It's the fact that somebody clicks on that button or that button does something for somebody.
Right, exactly. And even talking from like a business perspective, like if someone hits buy now and it doesn't take them to a page where they can buy now, that's a problem.
Yeah.
And it sounds so obvious, but a lot of times that's what you have to tell people. So I have found that, kind of to your point, I think there's more understanding of what our work is, but I think there's a lot of very, very surface level understanding. And so there's just so much advocacy that goes into our work, which is fine. I like talking about UX and why I think it's great. So that works for me.
Yeah, it must be an interesting transition from going from something that's very tangible with the knitting and the fashion of like people know what that is, even if they don't know what goes behind it, versus the UX, where oftentimes when the work is good, it's almost like invisible because you're like, oh, well, it just works.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's something that I've been kind of reconciling with my own work is like exactly what you said. The best UX is UX you don't notice. It just works. It does what you think it should. It shows up the way and looks the way you think it should. And it's been really interesting as I've kind of started this new career, learning just how much goes into making people feel like there's nothing happening at all. It's a really weird like thing to think about, but yeah, there's so much that goes into it.
So we can come back to some of this shop talk later, but I'd love to explore
Yeah.
some of your other creative pursuits. I can see because we're on Zoom, our listeners, I'll describe for them, but you're wearing a shirt that says "Don't Tell Comedy."
Oh yeah, I am.
And you've told me in our pre-interview that you had a comedy group as well. Can you tell us about that part of what you do?
Yeah, so I was a comedian, a stand-up comedian for about 4.5 years here in Boston, and it was a really awesome outlet, and it was a really great way for me to meet people and build a community and really have fun. I started doing stand-up because I'd lived in Toronto. That's where I did my undergrad and my master's and lived there for a long time. And then I moved back to Boston in 2013, and I was 26, 27, I guess, at the time. And I knew maybe a couple people from high school who were still around, but it's really hard to make friends as an adult, and especially in a city and especially in Boston. Like Boston, I think, has a reputation for being a little bit of a cold place, and that's not unfounded. And so it was just a really great way for me to kind of get out and start meeting people. And stand up was always something that I was really interested in. I grew up listening to Margaret Cho. She's just like one of my favorite people. I've probably seen her live like a dozen times. And I really emulated her a lot on stage. And so at one point I was trying to consider, is comedy something that I would want to do as a career? Thankfully, I made the decision not to do that because
Yeah.
now COVID's happening. There is really no comedy. It was a really great thing for me. I actually stopped doing stand up in January of this year
Oh, wow.
because I said, oh, I need to focus on my career change and I'm going to this really intensive boot camp. I can't be booking gigs and I can't be away on weekends because I have to be here to work. So I just said, okay, I'm going to put that on pause. And then 3 weeks later, everyone was on pause. So that's just kind of how it happened. But yeah, stand-up was so important to me. And I actually think stand-up has more to do with my UX work than necessarily like the fashion design stuff. I think of it a lot as, especially with regards to joke writing. For me, joke writing is an incredibly iterative process, like down to the very, very minute details. Now, granted, comedians vary in their styles. Some people are very, off the cuff and just like stream of consciousness. I am not that. The way I write my jokes is I literally write them out line by line and do kind of double spaced line breaks. And I can tell you just by looking at my joke, when to expect the laugh, when to expect a reaction. And it's a way for you to write very purposefully and to deliver jokes, cutting the fat and getting to the punchlines kind of as quickly as you can. There's a real science behind it. And it is probably is the thing that reminds me most of the design process, because I use the same opener in my set for about 3 years. And it was literally the same lines, the same words. And I'd change the pacing, sometimes not even the words, but like the pacing of a certain line to see if I got a better reaction, or change one word or add a phrase or something. And it was that kind of minute level of detail that I would use with writing jokes. And so it was really great, but oh my gosh, it's so much work. And,
Yeah.
I did comedy for 4.5 years, and by the end of it, I could solidly do a half hour after 4.5 years. Like it just takes so much, but it was great.
It seems like that's another parallel with UX, where a lot of the work is hidden.
Mm-hmm.
And then for the people who are experiencing it, it's like, unless the person doing the stand-up is like really bombing and just not funny, right? If it's sort of,
which happens sometimes,
But like when it's a good show, you're like, oh wow, that was great. And sometimes we forget all of the work that goes into doing a half-hour set or an hour set.
Totally. And for people who do this professionally, really good comics can write half an hour every couple months. So that just shows kind of the level of dedication and the level of their work ethic that goes into it. And again, it really depends on your style, but I know a lot of people who do write their jokes kind of in that very iterative process. And, talk about feedback, right? Feedback is so important in UX, but it is the basis of stand-up comedy, of live comedy. You'll get instant feedback and you'll know whether something's good or not right away when you're trying to tell a joke. Yeah.
And so what was that opening line that you used for 3 years?
It wasn't a line. It was like a short story. I did a very like narrative kind of style. I talked about how, so I'm a cancer survivor from when I was very, very young. I had cancer when I was 4. The gist of the joke was I'm a cancer survivor, but I'm bitter about it because I didn't get to meet any good celebrities. Like, it was and then I often would then tell a story about how Whitney Houston called me fat when I was 4. It's like a whole thing. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it was interesting how you were saying how that was the thing that you repeated. It reminds me of this quote from Brian Eno, who said that repetition is a form of change, right? So it must be, even if you were telling the same story every time, it must have been different. It's a different audience, a different venue. You're probably in a different emotional state as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that story did grow and change over time too. The reason that I used that as my opener, because of like the narrative kind of stand-up that I did, it was really important for me to explain right away to the audience who I was and what I was doing there. And I feel like that's something that a lot of like new comics or open mic comics kind of struggle with. I mean, especially if, sorry to say, but if you're another straight white male comic, you got to differentiate yourself somehow. And so being able to kind of talk about something about yourself that stands out. I mean, granted, the rest of my comedy was all about being gay and being kind of slutty and whatever, but like, there was all of that. But right. I felt like the cancer story was a really great way to show people who I was. I was able to be kind of like a little, talk about bitterness and talk about this potentially tragic thing, but in a humorous way with a wink. And then sort of talk about how it influenced the rest of my life, and which kind of was the rest of my set. And I mean, it was just a really great way to kind of introduce myself.
Yeah, that juxtaposition of the cancer survivor as a child and then the gay slutty stuff. It must, with just these two bookends, you can sort of communicate so much humanity and nuance to your identity there.
Exactly. I mean, I think that's what gave me the success that I had anyway. I certainly wouldn't have called myself a successful comedian, but like, it allowed me to get beyond just open mics, and I think it's because of that, like that humanity, like you said, you're understanding a little bit about who I am in a 5 minute set. So I was really all about that, and I take a lot of that inspiration from Margaret Cho. She is very personal in her comedy and talks a lot about, growing up and being LGBTQ. And she has those great stories about her high school friends who are drag queens. And she talks about this story that I won't repeat for your audience, but then talks about the very real aspect of the fact that they died of AIDS,
Mhm.
in the early 80s. And she had such a great way of bringing that like really humorous, really light, kind of dirty sense of humor, but then kind of bringing it down to such a human level. I think was exactly what I was trying to emulate.
Yeah, you've mentioned Margaret Cho being a big influence. I'm more familiar with some of her early work, and she does a lot of impressions of her mom or stories about her Korean mom.
Same kind of thing.
Yeah,
Yeah, same kind of thing. I mean, it's talking about the immigrant experience and talking about, which is something that a lot of people can relate to, but also just talking about crazy stuff her mom does, which is also something a lot of people can relate
yeah.
to.
Did you do impressions of your mom when you were doing stand up?
I did not. I am not a great impressionist, so I kind of avoided those. I did talk about my mom a little bit. There was a bit where I talked about my coming out story, which in a very kind of like Cliff Notes version, I came out to my mother because she walked in on me while I always call exploring my sexuality
Yeah.
in big air quotations. The punchline, but also the truth of it was she was almost like way too cool with it.
Mhm.
Like she like sat down and talked to me about why what I was doing was healthy, safe, and natural and developmentally appropriate. Meanwhile, I was like mortified, like turning beet
Yeah.
red, and like all of the like pop-ups from the porn website on my computer from 2001 were like preventing me from shutting it down. So it was a lot of that. But she that's the only time I really talked about her.
Yeah, even cool parents can be kind of cringe, right?
Oh my gosh, yes, they can.
Easy cook bear. And so let's talk about the bread now, because you've told
Hmm.
me that you mostly identify as a baker with this. The bread that you
Yeah.
did for your mom, like, do you have your sort of signature bread that you do, or you pride yourself more on like the range of different things that you make?
A little bit of both. This particular recipe I made, so I 2 years ago auditioned for the Great American Baking Show, which I figure we'll probably talk about. But in the audition process, I met a woman named Carmen Keels, who was a fellow baker who was auditioning, and she's based out of New York. And we hit it off like right away. I mean, we were only in the same room or in the same hotel for like 24 hours, but we just clicked and we had a great time. And it's so this the bread that I made from her is actually based on a recipe she gave me, and it's just a really great kind of French-ish, like rustic boule type bread. And what I love about it is you can play around with different kinds of flour to get different kinds of flavor and texture out of it. So yesterday I made just a pretty much white flour with, I think, about a quarter of it was whole wheat flour, but it bakes up into this really beautiful like round boule. I bake it in a cast iron, either skillet or Dutch oven, and it just comes out great every time. So I really do appreciate that. And that's definitely been one where I can kind of play around a little bit with, different flavorings or different flour and just sort of see what happens.
Do you have any tips or bread hacks for our listeners that maybe aren't quite ready to go full on baking bread from scratch?
I would say just try it. Like it's really not that hard. Most bread is four ingredients. It is flour, water, salt, and yeast. You can get it at any grocery store. You can just try it. You don't have to do sourdough. You don't have to do anything fancy. You just do flour, water, salt, and yeast and try it. I think the cool thing about bread making and the thing that people really work towards and try and do better is all about the technique. And there's so much that you can do, but you can also do a lot with very little. And I think that's one of the really exciting things about bread. I would say I like making bread. I am not a quote unquote bread baker, though. There are bread bakers who are very super intense about bread, super intense about like, oh, I had to get locally sourced flour and it was ground at this
Right.
particular, consistency. And like, I appreciate that. That's not my particular like realm, but I love that there's so much you can experiment with. Even like changing your oven temperature. If you up it 25 degrees and do a little bit shorter cook time, like what does that do to the crust? What does that do to the crumb? It can change things really significantly. And so I think once you kind of get that that basics down, there's really so much you can do. Yeah.
Yeah, this has me thinking back to what we were talking about earlier with the Brian Eno quote, repetition as a form of change, where even the same bread recipe, or the same flour, or the same water, it could be different from one bag of flour to another, or the temperature, the humidity is just different. And
Yeah,
it's different.
exactly. The weather can make your bread turn out different. So I think that's so interesting.
As someone who auditioned for the Bake Off, I know there's some NDAs involved, so you can't go into details as to what you experienced, but
Sure.
how did you decide to do that? And how did it feel, at least?
So I first learned about it through a good friend of mine named Stacy. She's here in Boston. She actually auditioned either the season or 2 seasons before I did. And Stacy is very much like my baking mentor. She was the one who kind of taught me about bread and taught me about pastry and that kind of thing. And pre-pandemic, we would spend weekends just like making crazy stuff.
Yeah.
The last thing we made together, what is the name of that in French? I forget. Basically, the Tower of Cream Puffs.
Croquembouche.
Yeah, croquembouche. Thank you. We have a tradition, a New Year's tradition with our friends where we do a pretty fancy like dinner party. Our two friends host a really nice dinner party, and then a few of us kind of bring some additional things. And so Stacy and I were on dessert duty, which is usually what we end up doing. And so yeah, we made a probably 2.5 foot tall croquembouche with a like star shaped sparkler on top that we lit right before New Year's. It was pretty great. So I first heard about the experience of doing the Bake Off audition from her, and she told me all of the stuff that she shouldn't have through her NDA, and talked about the process and what to expect. And I just decided that I would try it out. It is a multi-step process. There is a lot that you have to do, video recordings and interviews and quizzes and tests, and finally they do like a screen test audition. They flew me out to LA and did this whole thing. Every time I advanced, I was just like really, like this is what I'm this like really, and it gave me a lot of confidence, I think, in my baking. I ended up not getting on the show, but it was, to be honest, a very close call. I think I was definitely in the last round of auditions, and if there had been a B team, I probably would have been on it. But yeah, it gave me a lot of confidence, and it was just really fun. I mean, I talked about meeting Carmen, and she and I are still really good friends. We chat all the time. We actually had a very short-lived quarantine baking show that we were doing. And, we just constantly text each other recipes and ideas. And she runs a Facebook group it's sort of like a baking support group. And so we'll talk about all that stuff. It was awesome. I really, really enjoyed it. I would have auditioned again had I not been in the middle of a career change and then a pandemic.
Yeah. What was your short-lived show about? Was it a podcast or a YouTube show?
It was a Twitch live stream show. It was called Bake by Bake. And essentially what we did was we would each pre-record a video of us making a recipe, and then we would play an edited version of that video and then do like a live kind of banter back and forth over it. So it was part talk show, part informational. I mean, we did a bread episode, so I made bagels. Our first episode was just like our favorite recipes. So she did like a sheet cake and I did chocolate chip cookies. It was fun, but it was a little bit too much work for something that was meant to be for fun. It just kind of got ahead of me. So we decided to cancel it, but it was a good time. I'm always down for that kind of stuff.
I think there's a lot of excitement to like starting up a new creative project, but I feel like we also need to give and honor the shutting down of a project, and that like things have a shelf
Yes.
life, right? And if like the passion's not there or priorities change, it's like okay to honor what you have done, and it, you know, you can mourn, but it's still important to treat that as a thing, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the thing that was tough for me, I mean, we were working with a company, quote unquote company, a couple of guys that I knew from doing comedy who had started a like Twitch streaming platform. They still do tons of shows. The platform's called 2MB Studios. 2MB stands for Too Much Bread. It's not all cooking stuff. It just happened to be we did a cooking show, but they do lots of like online improv shows and stuff like that. It's actually really, really fun. But I think the thing that kind of got to me was because I was still in my career change and, you know, working, trying to work anyway. I basically said to them, like, if all I needed to do was do my recipe and talk on the show, that'd be great. But like, there's, as you know, so much else that goes into
Right.
it, right? All the behind the scenes stuff and the editing and the planning of the episodes and all of that stuff. And I couldn't handle it at the time. So yeah, if I'm ever in a position where I have a producer and a cameraman and an editor and a sound editor, then I'd love to do another cooking show, but I don't want to be all of those people.
Yeah, I have so much respect for the folks who are doing cooking shows on YouTube. I'm sure they often have people helping them with this, but like I've had friends ask me like, "Oh,
Yeah,
why don't you make more cooking videos?" And it's like, I'm trying to make the recipe and hold the camera, and you want me to edit this later? Like, I'll take pictures and I'll send you the
right.
recipe, but like, I don't think you need to watch a YouTube video of me making it.
Exactly. I'm like, the lighting in my kitchen is not great. Am I going to buy stand lights for my kitchen? No. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Like, come on, like there's only so much you can do for your like passion project, I think. And I think you're right. It's being willing to say, hey, this was really fun. I learned a lot. I enjoyed it, but I can't or don't even want to continue. That is valid and doesn't make it any less worthwhile. So,
So you've gone through this career change and then the pandemic happened and you've tried these different passion projects and you've wound them down. Do you have like other smaller passion projects or you just treat the baking as that right now as the complement to your designing?
I'm not really working on anything right now outside of my actual work and my job search. But I mean, I'm baking quite a bit still. I'm knitting quite a bit still, but it's not really like a passion project in the way that I'm like working towards building something that I'm going to release or whatever. Like, no, I think it's been kind of good to just be doing this stuff because I enjoy doing it. I like baking and I like eating the things I bake. I like knitting and I like wearing the things that I knit. And I think that is very okay too. You know, for the last decade, I turned my passion into a career. And I think it was great for me at the time, but sometimes you can leave your passions to just be your passions. Sometimes you can leave your interests to just be for fun. And that was something that I had to kind of learn for myself. Not everything needs to be your career or your avocation or like same thing with comedy. You know, comedy, I never made enough money for it to consider being my career, but I was to the point where I was traveling for comedy festivals and I was opening for some more well-known comics. And that was all really exciting and really, really fun. But there's something really joyful about just doing a local bar show for no like recognition or money or anything. It's just because you enjoy doing it. I'm honestly hoping that, you know, I can get back to that level of comedy when things open up again. It'd be really nice to just kind of perform because I enjoy doing it, you know?
Yeah. I think there is something too that you mentioned before about turning your passion into a career. And maybe it works out for a few years, but sometimes if you force yourself to stay into it, it can sour, right? Or you can get burned out.
Absolutely. When I closed my business, so I closed my business in 2017. I worked for another knitting company for about a year after that. After I left that job, I didn't knit for probably a year and a half. And that was my favorite thing to do for a decade. And I couldn't bring myself to do it. And that was kind of sad. It was not great to have the thing that was my passion be something I was actively avoiding because I was just tired of it.
Yeah. Well, thanks for opening up about that.
Yeah.
We'll close out with a lightning round of a couple questions.
Okay, sure.
So the first one is, do you have an easy cook recipe or just a cooking tip or trick for our listeners?
Okay, so I was thinking about this. I think I'm going to talk about chocolate chip cookies. Chocolate chip cookies are something that everyone likes to make, everyone likes to eat. It's not exactly a recipe, but my favorite like tip for chocolate chip cookies is using brown butter. So a lot of recipes will call for either softened butter or melted butter. What I like to do is add a little bit more butter than you're going to need because it's going to cook off. So the recipe I use calls for 3/4 of a cup. I add a whole cup. You basically just put the butter in a saucepan and cook it until it turns brown. Easy as that. And what it does is it changes the flavor so much and it adds a real kind of like nuttiness to the dough, and it makes it also spread and crackle a little bit more when you actually bake it off. And it just elevates your chocolate chip cookies beyond anything. So highly, highly recommend using brown butter. I actually have a couple of videos, I think, on my Instagram about it. But yeah, highly recommend. It's the way to go.
Well, thank you for that. Yeah, we'll find the links for that and post those in the show notes. And also, what are you listening to right now or reading or watching? Do you have recommendations of media for our listeners to check out?
Yes, my media consumption during the pandemic has been quite odd, but I've enjoyed it. I have been watching like basically 3 different things. I have been watching historical dramas. Margaret Cho has a joke of anything with Helena Bonham Carter in a petticoat, and I am in. It's basically true for me too. So new season of The Crown was great. Love like The Tudors, love the Borgias, all those shows on Netflix. I like historical dramas because I know what's going to happen because they're history. And a lot of times those shows are essentially like dramatic soap operas, but set in those times and with really pretty costumes. And so I love that. So historical dramas, I love those. I have also been watching a lot of British pub trivia shows. So there's these shows called The Big Fat Quiz, which in the UK is an annual tradition around Christmas every year. They do a pub quiz about trivia about the year. I think there's like 15 years worth on YouTube, which is great. They're really, really fun. So I watch those. And I also love local news bloopers. Don't ask me why. Like, this is the level I'm at during quarantine. I'm not bettering myself. I'm not pretending to like expand my mind. I have been working really hard. I have been, through a career change. I have been freelancing and applying to jobs. Sometimes I just need a little candy for my brain. And that's what I've landed on recently: historical dramas, quiz shows, and local news bloopers.
That's amazing. And I'll just second that. Helena Bonham Carter is amazing as Princess Margaret and just sort of devastating in this latest season of The Crown.
Yeah, so good.
And so finally, Dylan, can you just tell our listeners where they can find out more about you and find you online?
My website and all of my handles are just my name, DylanJUscher.com, @DylanJUscher. That's also my Gmail account if you want to email me. Like, it's literally everything. So it's
especially emailing you job offers.
Yes, I would love that. LinkedIn, same thing. I think, my LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and website and email are all the same. DylanJUscher.com.
Awesome. You're very consistent and easy to find.
Brand consistency is important. Also, having a name that is a little bit unique helps.
Yeah, I'm also Lee-Sean without a hyphen for absolutely everything that I can get my hands on.
There you go. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us on the show. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, this was so fun. Thank you.
Easy Cook.